Madam President, there is a lot of discussion in our country about how divided we are as a people. And there is no question that on many issues that is absolutely true. But it turns out that on one of the most important matters facing the American people, Democrats, Republicans, independents, progressives, moderates, and conservatives are all united. And they are united on the need to take on the outrageous corporate greed in the pharmaceutical industry and to substantially lower the incredibly high prices we pay for prescription drugs in this country. On that issue, the American people are quite united. Today, millions of Americans are forced to make the unacceptable choice between feeding their families or buying the medicine they need to ease their pain or to stay alive. Seniors from Vermont to Alaska are forced to split their pills in half because they don't have enough money to fill their prescriptions. Nobody really knows how many people die each year because they lack the medicine that their doctors prescribe. But a 2020 study by West Health found that by the year 2030, over 100,000 Medicare recipients could die prematurely every year because they cannot afford to buy their life-saving medicine. 100,000 seniors every year. Madam President, all over this country, every state in this country, the American people are asking some pretty simple questions. They want to know, how does it happen that in the United States we pay by far, not even close, the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs? How does that happen? Why is it, people are asking, that nearly 1 out of every 4 Americans cannot afford the prescriptions that their doctors write? Think about how crazy that is. People walk into a doctor's office to get a diagnosis. Doctor writes out a script. They can't afford to fill that prescription. They get sicker. Maybe they end up in the emergency room. Maybe they end up in the hospital. Maybe they die. People are asking, how does it happen that nearly half of all new drugs in the United States cost more than $150,000 a year? $150,000 a year. Madam President, a few years ago, I took a busload of people dealing with diabetes from Detroit, Michigan, over the Canadian border to a drugstore in Windsor, Ontario. I think the trip took us maybe 45 minutes. And there in Windsor, Canada, people on the bus, diabetics, were able to purchase the same insulin products that they bought in the United States for 1/10 the price. 45-minute trip, same product, 1/10 the price. And I'll never forget tears coming down the eyes of people who were buying that products. Couldn't believe how much money they were saving. In 1999, 24 years ago, I was a member of Congress, and I took another busload of people, this time women in northern Vermont who were suffering with breast cancer. We took them to a pharmacy in Montreal, Canada, and once again, they paid 1/10 the price for tamoxifen, a breast cancer drug that they desperately needed. So, Madam President, how does it happen that in Canada and other major countries, same exact medications manufactured by the same exact companies are sold for a fraction of the price that we pay in America? Simple question. Question Democrats, Republicans, Independents, everybody wants an answer to that. Well, the truth is that the answer to that question, in my view, is not complicated. And in fact, it can be summed up in just 3 words, and that is unacceptable corporate greed. Unacceptable corporate greed. Madam President, over the past 25 years, the pharmaceutical industry has spent $8.5 billion on lobbying. $8.5 billion on lobbying, and over $745 million on campaign contributions so that they can continue to pay, that we can continue to pay the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. Incredibly, last year, drug companies hired over 1,700 lobbyists to knock on every door in the Capitol. 1,700 lobbyists, former leaders of the Democratic Party, former leaders of the Republican Party. There are 535 members of Congress. You got 1,700 lobbyists from the pharmaceutical industry. 3 lobbyists for every member of Congress. Meanwhile, as Americans die because they cannot afford the medications they need, the pharmaceutical industry makes higher profits every year than other major industries. Year after year after year, they lead the index in terms of their profits. Between the years 2000 and 2018, drug companies in this country made over $8 trillion, that's with a T, $8 trillion in profits. In fact, in 2021, just 10 pharmaceutical companies in the United States made a total of more than $102 billion in profits, up 137% from the previous year. Madam President, it is the greed that we are seeing manifests itself not just in corporate profits. It also manifests itself in the exorbitant compensation packages that the pharmaceutical industry has given to its CEOs and other top executives within the industry. And I hope that people who are listening to us this afternoon, people who can't afford to pay for their prescription drugs, hear this. And that is according to a report done by the Health, Education, Labor, Pension Committee staff, of which I chair, released today. In 2021, while hundreds of thousands of Americans died from COVID, 50 pharmaceutical executives in just 10 companies made $1.9 billion in total compensation. 50 executives, $1.9 billion. And these same 50 executives are in line to receive up to $2.8 billion in golden parachutes once they leave their companies. Let me give you just a few examples. AbbVie CEO Richard Gonzalez made nearly $62 million in total compensation in 1 year. The CEO of Eli Lilly, David Ricks, made more than $67 million in 1 year. Incredibly, the CEO of Regeneron Pharmaceuticals, Leonard Schleifer, made nearly $453 million in total compensation in 1 year. $453 million in 1 year. Meanwhile, Madam President, while we are told over and over again that the reason we have such high drug prices in America is because of the need of the drug companies to invest in research and development. That's what we're told over and over again. We need to charge you outrageous prices so that we can use that money to invest in research and development for new drugs. Well, it turns out that over the past decade, 14 major pharmaceutical companies spent $747 billion not to research and develop life-saving drugs, but to make their wealthy shareholders even wealthier by buying back their own stock and handing out huge dividends. It turns out, amazingly enough, or maybe not amazingly, that the drug companies spent $87 billion more on stock buybacks and dividends than they spent on research and development. So when you hear about all of the need for high prices for research and development, they spent $87 billion more on stock buybacks and dividends than on research and development. Madam President, the truth is we are dealing here today not just with an economic issue in terms of the high price of prescription drugs. It's a very, very important economic issue. But we are dealing with something even more profound, and that is the moral issue. And the question I think that Americans should be asking themselves, is it morally acceptable that tens of thousands of people die each year in our country because they cannot afford the medicine their doctors prescribe, while at the same time the drug companies make billions in profits and provide their CEOs with huge compensation packages? Is it morally acceptable that at a time when the taxpayers of this country spent tens of billions a year on research and development for life-saving drugs, that many of these same taxpayers who help fund the research and development for new drugs are unable to afford those drugs? Is it morally acceptable that the business model of the pharmaceutical industry today is primarily not to create the life-saving drugs we need for cancer, Alzheimer's, heart disease, diabetes, and so many other terrible illnesses, but rather, through their excessive greed, to make as much money as they possibly can? Madam President, I should point out that it has not always been that way. There was once a time when the inventors of life-saving drugs were not obsessed with making huge sums of money, but were instead obsessed with ending the terrible illnesses that plagued humanity. In the 1950s, for example, there was Dr. Jonas Salk, who invented the vaccine for polio. Salk's work saved millions of lives and prevented millions more from suffering paralysis. It has been estimated that if Dr. Salk had chosen to patent the polio vaccine, he would have made billions of dollars. But he did not. When asked who owns the patent to this vaccine, this is what Dr. Salk said, quote, "Well, the people." I would say, "There is no patent. Could you patent the sun?" End of quote. What Dr. Salk understood was that the purpose of the vaccine he invented was to save lives, to make sure that as many people all over the world were able to receive it, and not to make himself obscenely rich. And Salk, among other great scientists, was not alone. In 1928, Alexander Fleming, a scientist from Scotland, discovered penicillin at St. Mary's Hospital in London. Fleming's discovery of penicillin changed the medical world and saved millions of lives. I am sure that Alexander Fleming could also have become a multi-billionaire if he chose to own the exclusive rights to this antibiotic. But he did not. When Fleming was asked about his role, he did not talk about the outrageous fortune he could have made through his discovery. Instead, he said, quote, "I did not invent penicillin, nature did that. I only discovered it by accident," end quote. And then, Madam President, there was the great scientist Frederick Banting from Canada. In 1921, Dr. Banting, along with two other scientists at the University of Toronto, invented insulin, drug we're hearing a whole lot about now. When Dr. Banting was asked why he wouldn't patent insulin and why he sold the rights to his invention for $1, he replied, quote, "Insulin does not belong to me, it belongs to the world," end of quote. Frederick Banting. It has been estimated that Dr. Banting's invention of insulin saved some 300 million lives. Once again, in Dr. Banting, we saw a great scientist make it clear that his purpose in life was to help humanity, prevent suffering, save lives, not just to make billions for himself. Meanwhile, Madam President, while Dr. Banting sold his patents for insulin for $1 so that humanity could benefit from his discovery, I should point out that Eli Lilly, one of our nation's largest drug companies, has increased the price of insulin by 1,200% over the past 27 years to $275, while it costs just $8 to manufacture. Selling it for $275 costs $8 to manufacture. Not quite the spirit of Frederick Banting. Now let's fast forward to the COVID pandemic. This horrible moment in our history where we have lost over 1 million Americans and tens of millions have suffered various levels of illness. Moderna, a drug company in Massachusetts, worked alongside the National Institute of Health to develop the vaccine that so many of our people have effectively used by millions of people effectively. It is widely acknowledged that both the company and the National Institute of Health, NIH, were responsible for the creation of this vaccine. They worked together. After the company received billions of dollars from the federal government to research, develop, and distribute the COVID vaccine, well, guess what happened? Turns out that the CEO of Moderna, Stefan Bancel, became a billionaire overnight and is now worth $5.7 billion. Further, the two co-founders of Moderna, Noubar Afeyan and Robert Langer, also became billionaires and are now both worth $2 billion each. And one of the founding investors in Moderna, Tim Springer, is worth $2.5 billion. None of them were billionaires before the taxpayers of our country funded the research and development for the COVID-19 vaccine. And collectively, these handful of people at Moderna are now worth over $11 billion. And meanwhile, Moderna as a whole made over $19 billion in profits during the pandemic. Given that reality, given the enormous amount of taxpayer support, how has the CEO of this country thanked the taxpayers of America for the huge profits that Moderna has experienced and for the incredible wealth that he and his other executives have experienced? Well, he is thanking them by proposing to quadruple the price of the COVID vaccine to about $130 once the government stockpile runs out. And let us be clear, by the way, this is a vaccine that costs just $2.85 to manufacture. Madam President, on March 22nd, the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee will be holding a hearing to discuss this subject. And bottom line that we will be discussing, does Moderna think that it is appropriate to quadruple prices for the vaccine after receiving billions of dollars in taxpayer support? Madam President, while Moderna may be a poster child for contemporary corporate greed, certainly they are not alone. A number of years ago, the former CEO of Gilead became a billionaire by charging $1,000 for Sovaldi, a hepatitis C drug that was discovered by scientists at the Veterans Administration. This drug costs just $1 to manufacture and could be purchased in India for $4. The Japanese drug maker, Astellas, which made $1 billion in profits in 2021, recently raised the price of the prostate cancer drug Xtandi by more than 75% in the United States to nearly $190,000. This is a drug that was invented by federally funded scientists at UCLA and can be purchased in Canada for 1/6 the price charged in America. Taxpayers fund the development of the drug and now pay 6 times more than Canadians do for the same product. And it goes on and on and on. Madam President, there is no rational reason why the HIV treatment, Biktarvy, costs over $45,000 per year in the U.S., but only $7,500 in France. Or why a weekly dose of the autoimmune medicine Enbrel costs over $1,700 in the U.S., but just $300 in Canada, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Goes on and on and on. Madam President, the American people, regardless of their political affiliations, are sick and tired of being ripped off by the pharmaceutical industry. Now is the time for us to have the courage to take on the 1,700 lobbyists all over Capitol Hill, to take on the unlimited financial resources of that industry. Now is the time to stand with the American people and substantially lower prescription drug prices in our country. And the Health, Education, Labor, Pension Committee is going to be actively involved in that process. Thank you, Madam President. With that, I yield the floor.